Hello friends and constant readers, my name is Emily and welcome back to the Dark Tower series. Today we're once again going to be talking about genre. So in last week's episode, I talked a little bit about genre fiction versus literary fiction and the sort of arbitrary distinctions between those two. I will try and remember to leave a link to that video in the cards up above and in the description box down below. So if you've been following along, you know that I have been reading the Dark Tower series as a piece of fantasy literature. And the reason for that is multiple. Be it my own research interests, my own area of expertise, my own preference in literature, the fact that I think that fantasy is one of the more literary of the genres that fall under the larger umbrella of the fantastic. That has been my approach to the series, and I have largely been ignoring the ways in which the series touches on other genres just because I'm not super interested in them as a whole, as a field of study. In thinking about the episodes and like what is left, where I want to go with the series, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about the other genres that the series does fit into, for the sake of mentioning that they do exist. There are a couple here that I think you could easily place the series into and argue that it is part of this genre in the same way that I see it being part of fantasy literature. And one of those genres is westerns. And so the question that I sort of asked myself at the beginning of this research was, is the Dark Tower series a genre western in terms of key genre features or tropes? Like, is it just that these superficial elements make us think Western, or is there really something meatier there to tie it to the Western genre? So Westerns are stories set in the latter half of the 19th century in the American Old West. They largely center on the nomadic cowboy or the gunfighter. List of recurring characters include cowboys, Native Americans, bandits, lawmen, bounty hunters, outlaws, soldiers, and settlers. These stories tend to stress the hardships of wilderness. It's pretty bleak a lot of the time. And so this landscape, as almost a character in and of itself, is a big part of the Western. Westerns tend to use a stock plot of a crime, the pursuit of the wrongdoer, revenge and retribution. And this revenge and retribution usually comes via shootout. This struck me as really linking the Western to the romance novel, because both Westerns and romance novels have the same sort of, not the same formula, but have a formula that occurs in every story, largely every story. There's been a ton of research done on romance novels and why people like romance novels, even if they're all sort of samey. And it's actually what they like about romance novels. I read a whole book devoted to the study of readers of romance novels and why people return to them, and it's about that familiarity. It's about knowing the formula and knowing what you're getting into. This isn't a deep dive into any of these particular genres. That's not what I'm here to do. This is sort of just a taste, a tip of the iceberg. So based on the general formula of a Western, do I think The Dark Tower fits into the Western genre? In terms of setting and characters, it borrows heavily from the Western genre. We have a gunslinger as our main character. He is, I would say he's a lawmaker in his gunslinger role who is looking to police his realms. We see that especially in Wizard and Glass, where he is sent into this town to deal with the shenanigans happening there. We also see this in The Wind Through the Keyhole, when he moves into this town that is experiencing trouble and he's investigating these gruesome murders in the town. So I see Roland as more of the lawmaker figure. In terms of Western setting, the desolate landscape, the wilderness of it, the unfamiliarity of it, everything sort of feels precarious, and like where they are is high stakes because the world is crumbling, you don't really know what's happening anymore, time isn't even predictable, so like the whole setting isn't predictable, it's an unknown, which I feel like meshes well with this American frontier setting of the Western. Where I think the Dark Tower series differs, and is arguably why I don't think it fits into the Western genre and why it wouldn't appeal to the Western reader who is seeking Westerns specifically for the formulaic plot. The plot of the Dark Tower series is in no way formulaic. If you start out with the gunslinger, thinking that this is a Western, that there has been a crime and that you're going to get a pursuit of a wrongdoer and then a big revenge moment via like this very predictable shootout plot, I think you will be greatly disappointed. The plot of The Gunslinger is, I would say, largely very hard to predict unless you are looking at the more literary aspects of the series. If you didn't pick up on the literary references, you didn't get Yeats's gyre, all that sort of 20th century mumbo jumbo that is part of literature, I feel like there's no way to predict the plot of this novel, and so in that way, this series doesn't serve the same function as a Western story typically does, which is that sort of catharsis of entering into a really familiar story. Like, you know where it's going the minute you crack the front page. You know where it's going to end. It's going to be a happy ending. The hero is going to achieve his goals. There's going to be a big epic battle. That's it. That's what you're going into for a Western. I would say that in terms of like the key structural elements of a Western, the plot, that formulaic plot, the Dark Tower series isn't a Western. It borrows from the Western, but we could never fairly sell it to the same readership that reads Westerns. So the next genre I think that we need to ask ourselves about is horror. Now, I know in the previous episode that I've posted, I have seen that a lot of you, depending on where you are in the world, this book is put in different places in your bookstore. So for the Canadian bookstores, Stephen King is considered horror. He's not considered general fiction. He is considered a genre fiction, and we put all of his works in to horror. I'm going to generalize because I work for Indigo, which is the large chain book retailer in Canada. I don't actually think there are nationwide chains anymore. There might be small book chains within provinces, but Indigo is quite widespread. It bought up Chapters and Coles. Those have been folded into the Indigo brand, so even in places where that old branding is still left on buildings in Canada, it's still part of one retail company, and we have the same inventory system across the board, which makes sense. So I know that all bookstores owned by the Indigo company will put Stephen King in the same place. Because Stephen King writes horror, you might expect that this is horror. And I mean, it's put in the horror category. It's put in the category with the rest of his works. So a reader of horror might pick it up and expect horror, which is reasonable. But is it horror? That is the next question I asked myself in research. Is the Dark Tower series horror in terms of larger genre conventions? Horror is a genre of speculative fiction. Again, it's part of that larger umbrella of the fantastic that I keep talking about, and it's intended to frighten or disgust readers, or maybe make the reader feel a sense of repulsion or loathing. Horror is designed to create an eerie or frightening atmosphere. It's frequently supernatural, although it doesn't have to be. People themselves are pretty fucked up. When horror does have a supernatural element, or there is some sort of otherworldly creature in it, that creature is often a metaphor for the fears of society at that point in time. Horror stories, of course, have their roots in folklore and religious stories. Horror is a lot more in line with my research interests into fantasy and stories that fall under the fantastic than Westerns are, and I would love to, in the future when this series is done, do a horror deep dive. If you are interested in a horror deep dive, be sure to leave a thumbs up on this video, leave me a comment, say yes please horror deep dive. Those folk and religious stories come from the ancient Greeks and Romans, actually. Like, they go back far in our literary history. Even the like sort of prototypical haunted house story where the haunting happens because the body is buried within the grounds of the house and like then the spirit is stuck there, comes from this time period. Werewolf stories were popular in medieval France. A lot of the horror that I think we think of today, like when I say horror, you're probably thinking like Dracula, that kind of stuff. That comes from the most terrible humans of the 15th century. We have Dracula, who's been traced back to the Prince of Wallachia, Vlad III. We have Bluebeard, who's inspired by the serial killer Guy. Good thing I can read my own handwriting. We have the vampiress, who is connected to the murderous Elizabeth Bathory, who I find absolutely fascinating and horrifying at the same time. If you have not looked into Elizabeth Bathory and you like history and you like horror and you like vampires, give her a Google because it's great. In the worst way. In the 18th century, we see the development of Romanticism and the Gothic horror genre. So that is drawing on a lot of material from the late Middle Ages, and a lot of this Gothic fiction was written and marketed towards women. Neat. I am genuinely curious as to why. I am just skimming the surface here as well, but maybe in a horror deep dive I can look into that question. Why was horror marketed to women in the 18th century? Should be fun. So the 19th century is where we see really what we think of as horror today. The Brothers Grimm, Hansel and Gretel in 1812. We have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818. We have Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820. We have Edgar Allan Poe in the 19th century. We have Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1818. And we have Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. In the 20th century, we see the proliferation of cheap periodicals, all that lovely pulp fiction, and so we get Lovecraft. Also at this time, we have that sort of sensational journalism, so we get the stories of Ed Gein and the Manson family. 20th century, we also get Hannibal Lecter. Thomas Harris introduces Hannibal Lecter to the world. And then of course, Stephen King is considered part of late 20th century horror, and I feel like is probably the biggest household name in horror. So characteristics of the genre, and I'm gonna pop a quote up on the screen from Lovecraft here. Quote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." End quote. Readers seek out these stories for a sense of excitement, and I wonder if part of that has to do with the, I guess, sanitizing of our society. I think especially now, most people don't experience the same sorts of hardships as humans have in the past, and so we don't have a lot of fear of the unknown in our day-to-day. Like, horror is one of the few mediums that I think allows people to really seek out that unknown feeling and confront ideas that they would otherwise ignore. Two books that I want to check out that I came across in my research that I'm going to just put out there if you're interested in looking into horror more are Technologies of Monstrosity by Jay Halberstam and Philosophy of Horror by Noel Carroll. Given that horror is about frightening or disturbing, disgusting the reader, does the Dark Tower series do that for me? I mean, there hands down is exploration of the unknown. There is unease when it comes to the setting of the story. The story is in a time that's falling apart, that's inconsistent, and time is one of those things that we depend on. Our world revolves around time, and it's always the same, and it always makes sense. We are so regimented, and so time is this constant for us. So in the Dark Tower, that time is unraveling, time doesn't make sense. I suppose that's uneasy, but not in the same way, I suppose, that It makes me uneasy, or The Shining makes me uneasy. Does it instill fear in me? For me personally, no. Possibly the most horrific thing about the series is the moment that you realize that Roland is stuck in a repetition. He's stuck in this gyre, living the same life over and over again. But because the series is so literary, because it's so meta, I wonder if that repetition is more about the experience of being fictional because that repetition, the design of the books, the first and last line of the series, like that whole like Man in Black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed, opens and closes the series so that you immediately go back, and it's the experience of being fictional, of being aware that you're fictional to some degree. It's meta. So for me, I also wouldn't put the Dark Tower series in the same boat as Salem's Lot with vampires, The Shining with ghosts. There are definitely those sorts of horror aspects lacking, I think, from the Dark Tower series. And maybe, well, I guess the vampires are there because things overlap. But again, I think any elements of horror that you encounter in the Dark Tower series are more about the overlapping of worlds, the overlapping of fiction and reality, the asking of the question, what is fiction and reality? Where do these two things meet? Where do they draw a hard line? And less about horror elements being included to instill horror in the readers. Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of where I sit with that. The next category that I think is maybe worth talking about is dark fantasy. Brian Stapleforth argues that the difference between a contemporary fantasy and a dark fantasy is as follows. A contemporary fantasy is a supernatural horror set in the primary world. That would mean that all of Stephen King's works are technically, by his definition, contemporary fantasies. Carrie is set in the contemporary world. Salem's Lot, The Shining, It. Those books are all set within a contemporary setting, and these supernatural horror elements take place in our primary world. He goes on to make the distinction that dark fantasy is supernatural horror set in a secondary world. So the Dark Tower does take place in a secondary world, but I am not sure that the events that happen in that world are horror. They might be fantasy, but I don't know that they're horror, so I don't know that it can be a dark fantasy. The last genre that I came across that sort of, I guess, meshed with my idea of the Dark Tower series is the even harder to define weird fiction. So weird fiction is a subgenre of speculative fiction, again, the fantastic, and John Clute defines it as follows, quote, fantasy, supernatural fiction, and horror tales embodying transgressive materials, end quote. Weird fiction is more of a historic term used to define a specific group of literature that was written in the 1930s, but it has been increasingly used recently to describe fiction that blends horror, fantasy, and science fiction, or breaks the boundaries between these genres. I think out of any of the genres here today, I would be most comfortable slapping the label of weird fiction over the Dark Tower series, specifically because of that blending element. The blending of horror and fantasy and debatably science fiction. I think that is the maybe strongest subcategory that we could put the Dark Tower series in. I don't think it's interesting to just be like, yeah, this is weird fiction. It just blends. Again, I'm just skimming the surface in terms of research because this isn't a deep dive into weird fiction, but the label of weird fiction doesn't seem super useful to me because giving something a specific genre means that you can look at it next to its contemporaries and ask questions, make comparisons, look at how a text is changing a genre, and just slapping a label of weird fiction over this series that we maybe don't know what to do with or has too much going on isn't helpful. That is why I lean towards fantasy, and we will talk about fantasy next week in next week's episode, but I thought it was worth mentioning these other categories. I'd love to know your thoughts on genre categories in the comments down below. Where do you see the Dark Tower series falling? Before we go, we have to thank my patrons. Thank you, patrons, for making videos like this and long-form content possible. I really appreciate the work that you enable me to do. Links to the Patreon page are always in the description box down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, long days and pleasant nights.